My name is Fabiola Miranda, and I will be presenting on smallpox. So, this is one of the most widespread, most ancient diseases seen within human history. It's thought to have first appeared in 10,000 BC, around the same time that the first agricultural settlements were appearing. The first physical manifestations that we have of this disease can be traced back to mummies, as far back to 1570 BC. So, the infectious agent for smallpox belongs to the genus Orthopox viruses, and the species is the variola virus. Characteristics of this variola virus are that its genome is single, linear, its DNA is double-stranded, and it contains up to 20,000 base pairs, which makes it one of the largest animal viruses ever recorded. It also replicates within the cytoplasm. A quick note about the orthopox viruses is that they are pretty much all homologously similar, and this becomes really important when it comes to vaccines and how it doesn't necessarily have to be the variola virus that is used. It actually isn't the variola virus at all that's used in vaccines. It's other species that belong to the same genus of orthopox viruses, and that's possible because they all are so similar in the specific antigens that they have. So, this is a specific picture of the variola major virus. So, no animal reservoir other than humans exists. Two different predominant types of variola do exist. There's variola major, which is much more common than variola minor, or was much more common than variola minor, having up to 15 to 45% of a fatality rate, so much more widespread. Variola minor was not seen quite as much. It didn't appear until later in the 18 to 1900s, and it only has up to 1% fatality rate, even less than that. So the primary mode of transmission for smallpox would be direct contact, but airborne transmission is also possible, and fomites are another method of transmission. A famous example of this would be the Native Americans having received blankets that were infested with the smallpox disease, and thus a large portion of them died because they had no immunity to it. And another method of transmission would be direct contact with any of the scabs that result from the smallpox rash, or contact with an infected person's bodily fluids. So smallpox incubation period can last up to 12 days, maybe more, maybe less. And the first symptoms that will appear, signs and symptoms that appear, is always a fever and a head-splitting headache. And backaches can be a symptom, vomiting, and chills as well, but not always. 2 to 3 days later is when the rash appears, and this is really the hallmark of the disease. It's the most distinguishing feature, and it's when this rash appears that a person it's most infectious. It's when the disease is spread through the appearance of this rash, pretty much. And this rash will persist for up to 3 weeks, but afterwards the scabs of the pustules that appeared from the rash will fall off, and this person will now be have immunity for the rest of their life against this disease. So this is an example of an infant with smallpox, and this specific picture is actually really important for the eradication campaign. They used this picture and they put it, or called it, as a specific recognition card. So what they would do is that they would take this picture and they would take it to many of the schools where smallpox was endemic and ask if they had seen, or if they knew of any cases of smallpox near them. And it proved super efficient. They were able to isolate many more people using this recognition card than going house by house to check if anybody was infected. So the best way to diagnose this, or the easiest way to diagnose this, is to look at the specific rash that appears on the person on the 2nd to 3rd day, since it is its most distinguishing symptom. Physicians also would use the location to see if perhaps a sick person lived in an area where the smallpox was endemic, or they could use labs as well. But the rash was really a much more clinically significant type of way to distinguish as well, because the different rashes would signify the different type of smallpox, since there exist many different kinds. The most common one would be ordinary smallpox, which is the classical type. It's what was seen in 90% of the smallpox cases. There was also flat smallpox, which is like ordinary, except that the pustules of the rash wouldn't be as raised as they normally would be. Plus, flat smallpox infected mostly infants. Modified smallpox was much more accelerated than normal smallpox, so the rash would appear quicker and it would be over in less time. And it was also a milder form of it, not as fatal. Hemorrhagic smallpox, which you can tell from the name, is probably the worst, or is the worst type of smallpox. There would be bleeding from the pustules, and this affected mostly adults and pregnant women for whatever reason, and it was pretty much always fatal. Cyanoquine was the most difficult of the smallpox types to diagnose, seeing as how no actual rash would appear. So they would require blood screening to correctly diagnose this specific type. So Dr. Cody already talked about the history of the vaccine, how the first vaccine was created by Edward Jenner against the smallpox virus. So I'm just going to speak briefly about the difference between inoculation and vaccination, instead of going through the whole history of that again. So inoculation is what people used to use to try to prevent against the disease, because before vaccination, there was no other method, and there still is no method of preventing smallpox once it's been contracted. So inoculation was pretty efficient in that it did decrease the fatality of the disease. So people that had been inoculated against it would see a decrease in fatality from up to 10 times than if they would just wait to contract it normally. But this did make them much more susceptible to infection, and there was a 2 to 3% chance that a person would die from inoculation. And most importantly, it led to the further spread of the disease as well. So vaccination, when Edward Jenner came up with it, was actually much more safer than inoculation. And his first vaccination utilized the cowpox virus. So it wasn't variola virus that he used in his vaccine. It was cowpox virus, which is within the same genus of the orthopox viruses, like I said, because they're all similar. So eradication was first proposed by the World Health Organization in 1958, and it was actually the Russians who spearheaded this program. And this was actually pretty effective. In 1958, one would see that within the populations where smallpox was endemic, up to 59% of the population was infected. And then when they checked again in 1966, it was only 31%. But they decided that the numbers weren't low enough, and they decided that in 1966 to try to amplify the response and see if by amplifying it, they would be able to annihilate smallpox within 10 years. So 2 important components of trying to fulfill this promise was to try to vaccinate 80% of the populations, so that the reasoning behind this was that then it would be easier to isolate the specific cases where smallpox did appear and quarantine them however they needed to be. So that was the second component as well, surveillance and containment. And this was hugely successful, such that the World Health Organization declared smallpox globally eradicated in 1980. So, seeing as how, like I said, this is the only disease that has been successfully eradicated, people really looked to smallpox and the different methods used in its eradication to try to see if they can try to use the same methods in the eradication of other diseases like polio or measles. And these are specific diseases that can be used, where the same eradication methods can be used, because the disease share certain characteristics, such as that they have no animal reservoir, and they have no vectors, and also that once they're vaccinated against, the people have lifelong immunity. So these are really important. Another thing to know about smallpox and its eradication is that there is still some controversy surrounding the fact that there are still some stores of smallpox, because there's a lot of worry of the threats of bioterrorism for this age, but World Health Organization is monitoring it closely. And these are my citations. Thank you.